The Galactic Council had what they thought was a brilliant idea. Every cycle, they'd drop different species onto the most hostile planets they could find, hand them identical survival kits, and see who lasted longest. They called it the Ultimate Species Survival Challenge, though most civilized beings just called it that stupid reality show the Council won't shut up about. This cycle's contestants were the usual suspects. The Vorthak methodical engineers who could probably build a space elevator out of paperclips and sheer determination. The Mindori, a telepathic collective that moved like a synchronized swimming team having a group thought. The Zephyrians, shapeshifters who could adapt to anything short of a black hole, and even then they'd probably give it a good try. And then there were the humans. Nobody really knew how they got invited. Some said it was a clerical error. Others claimed it was the Council's idea of comic relief. The leading theory was that someone had mixed up Homo sapiens with Homo superior on the application form, and by the time anyone noticed, the paperwork was already filed in triplicate across 17 different departments. The three humans stood in the staging area looking like they'd wandered into the wrong convention. While the other species conducted elaborate pre-mission rituals and strategic planning sessions, the humans were arguing about whether their survival kits came with warranties. Council observer Zith Era watched through the monitoring screens with barely concealed amusement. These soft, pink creatures thought they could compete with species that had been mastering survival for millennia. The humans didn't even have proper claws, for the love of the great void. Their skin was so thin you could practically see through it, and they leaked salt water when they got stressed. "This should be entertaining," Zith Ara muttered to his assistant. "I give them 2 standard time units before they're crying for extraction." The planet they'd chosen was a real charmer. Designation, Nightmare 7. Toxic atmosphere that would melt most organic compounds, weather patterns that made hurricanes look like gentle breezes, and wildlife that considered everything else on the food chain to be appetizers. The survival kits were standard issue, basic shelter pods, water purification tablets, emergency rations, medical supplies, and a few tools. Nothing fancy, nothing that would give any species an unfair advantage. The Vorthak team leader, Commander Thex, examined the humans with professional interest. "Fascinating specimens," he noted. "Primitive tool use, minimal natural defenses, no apparent survival instincts. They'll make excellent case studies in evolutionary dead ends." The Mindari collective simply hummed in harmonic agreement. Their shared consciousness found the humans' chaotic individual thoughts amusing, like listening to 3 different radio stations at once. The Zephyrians didn't bother with commentary. They were too busy analyzing the atmospheric data and planning their initial adaptation strategies. Meanwhile, the humans were still arguing. "I'm telling you, this thing looks like it was designed by someone who's never actually seen a planet," one of them was saying, holding up what was clearly a standard-issue atmospheric processor. "Maybe it's supposed to look like that," another replied. "You know, alien technology and all." "Or maybe," said the third, "someone up there has a really twisted sense of humor." The countdown began. 10 standard time units until deployment. The other species fell into respectful silence, mentally preparing for the challenge ahead. The humans started taking bets on who would break something first. Jake Morrison had been kicked out of the military for what his commanding officer diplomatically called creative interpretation of orders. What Jake called making boring stuff actually work. He stood 6 feet tall with the kind of cocky grin that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't either fix or make worse while trying to fix it. "So," Jake said, poking at their survival kit with obvious skepticism, "anyone else think this stuff looks like it came from the bargain bin at Alien Depot?" Luna Rodriguez bounced on her toes like she'd had way too much caffeine. As a botanist, she was supposed to be excited about discovering new plant life. The problem was, Luna got excited about everything, especially things that could kill her. She had the kind of enthusiasm that made people either love her immediately or slowly back away while making emergency phone calls. "Oh my God, look at this," Luna squealed, holding up what appeared to be a seed packet. "These are probably for growing emergency food crops, but I bet they're completely wrong for this planet's soil composition. This is going to be so much fun to figure out." Marcus Tank Thompson was the kind of guy who apologized when other people bumped into him. Built like a brick house, but with the temperament of a golden retriever, Tank had spent 15 years as a heavy machinery mechanic. He had a gift for making broken things work again, usually by hitting them with the right wrench at the right angle, while muttering apologies to whatever he was fixing. "Sorry about this," Tank mumbled, accidentally crushing a monitoring device while trying to examine their shelter pod. "These things are just so delicate." The alien observers watched this display with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Vorthak had spent the last hour conducting detailed equipment inspections and creating comprehensive deployment strategies. The Mindari had achieved perfect synchronization with their kit components. The Zephyrians had already begun adapting their physiology to better handle the tools. The humans were treating their survival equipment like a clearance sale at a hardware store. "Seriously though," Jake continued, "who designs a shelter that only fits one person? What if you want to have a party? What if you need to store stuff? What if you just don't like being alone with your thoughts for however long this thing is supposed to last?" "Maybe it's a cultural thing," Luna suggested, now examining what looked like a water purification system. "Like, maybe most species prefer solitary survival experiences. Ooh, or maybe it's a test to see if we'll share resources. That would be so sneaky." Tank nodded seriously. "That makes sense. Sorry for not thinking of that first." He paused, looking at the bent piece of metal in his hands that used to be part of their communications array. "Also sorry about this. I think it's supposed to beep or something, but now it just doesn't." The staging area fell silent as the other species turned to stare at the humans. The Vorthak's compound eyes widened in what might have been shock or admiration. The Mindari collective's humming took on a discordant note. Even the Zephyrians paused their preparations to observe this unprecedented approach to pre-mission protocol. Council observer Zithara felt the first stirring of unease. In all his years overseeing these challenges, he'd never seen contestants so blatantly disregard basic survival principles. The humans weren't just unprepared, they were aggressively unprepared. They were approaching their equipment like they were planning to renovate it rather than use it. "This is either going to be the shortest challenge on record," Zithara muttered, "or the most interesting." The deployment countdown reached final phase. Transport pods materialized around each team, ready to drop them onto Nightmare 7's hostile surface. The other species assumed their positions with practiced efficiency. The humans were still arguing about whether their emergency flares were the right color. "I'm just saying," Jake called out as his transport pod sealed. "Red flares are so last millennium. Where's the style? Where's the personality?" Luna's pod engaged with a cheerful hiss. "Maybe they'll look better against the alien sky," she said hopefully. "Everything's better with the right lighting." Tank's pod closed with what sounded like several components falling off. "Sorry about the noise," his voice echoed through the comm system. "I think I leaned on something important." The other contestants said nothing. They were too busy being professional. The humans were dropped onto Nightmare 7, still debating the aesthetic merits of emergency equipment. This was going to be interesting. Standard survival protocol was simple. Find shelter, secure water, establish a perimeter, assess threats, maintain equipment, survive. The Galactic Council had refined these procedures over thousands of cycles, testing them against hundreds of hostile environments and dozens of species. They worked. They were logical. They were proven. The humans looked at standard protocol and said, "Yeah, but what if we did something completely different instead?" The Vorthak team deployed their shelter pods exactly according to specifications. 3 individual units positioned in a defensive triangle, each equipped with standard atmospheric processors, basic life support, and emergency communications. Textbook perfect. The Mindari collective established their pods in a pattern that maximized their telepathic network efficiency. The Zephyrians adapted their pods to blend seamlessly with the local terrain. The humans took one look at their 3 identical survival pods and immediately decided they were inadequate. "Okay, so we've got 3 tiny metal boxes that are supposed to keep us alive on a planet that's actively trying to kill us," Jake announced, kicking one of the pods experimentally. "Anyone else see the problem here?" Luna was already examining the atmospheric data streaming across her pod's display. The air out there is basically sulfuric acid with a side of radiation. These things are rated for, oh wow. They're rated for way less than what's actually out there. Tank looked at his pod, then at the hostile landscape visible through the transparent aluminum viewport, then back at his pod. Sorry to say this, he said apologetically, but I don't think these are going to cut it. The alien observers watched with growing confusion as the humans began doing something unprecedented. Instead of activating their survival pods, they started taking them apart. What are they doing? Council observer Zithara demanded, leaning forward in his monitoring chair. His assistant checked the readings twice. Sir, it appears they're disassembling their emergency shelters. That's impossible. The survival pods are sealed units. They can't be disassembled without specialized tools. On the screen, Tank was somehow removing panels from his pod using what appeared to be a bent spoon in his bare hands. Sorry about this, he was saying to the pod as he worked. This probably voids the warranty. Jake was examining the internal components with obvious disappointment. Look at this power core. It's basically a fancy battery. And these atmospheric processors, they're just running standard filtration algorithms. There's no adaptation protocols, no efficiency scaling, no backup systems. That's because they're emergency survival equipment, Luna pointed out, while simultaneously collecting soil samples and what looked like crystallized atmospheric residue. They're supposed to keep you alive, not comfortable. But why settle for alive when you could have comfortable? Jake replied, now knee-deep in his pod's circuitry. I mean, we're going to be here for a while, right? Might as well make the best of it. The other species watched this display with varying degrees of alarm. The Vortak team leader sent a formal communication requesting clarification on whether pod modification was allowed under challenge rules. The Mundari collective's shared consciousness was experiencing something that might have been secondhand embarrassment. The Zephyrians simply noted the humans' behavior as suboptimal survival strategy and continued with their own preparations. Meanwhile, the humans had moved beyond simple disassembly into what could only be described as aggressive re-engineering. If we reroute the power coupling through the atmospheric processor's backup systems, Jake was explaining, we can boost the filtration capacity by at least 300%. And if we merge the life support systems from all three pods, Tank added, somehow managing to lift components that should have required heavy machinery, we could create a much larger habitable space. Luna looked up from her impromptu chemistry experiment. Plus, I'm pretty sure I can synthesize a better atmospheric seal using these mineral deposits. The local flora is producing some really interesting compounds. The monitoring station fell silent except for the sound of Zethara's 4 hearts beating in different rhythms of panic. Sir, his assistant whispered, should we intervene? This level of equipment modification is completely outside established parameters. Zethara watched Jake somehow rewire a power core using components that weren't supposed to be compatible. I don't know. The rules don't actually prohibit modification. They just assume no one would be insane enough to try it. On Nightmare 7's surface, the humans had transformed their neat survival deployment into what looked like a cross between a construction site and a mad scientist's laboratory. Components were scattered everywhere, systems were being rewired in ways that defied engineering logic, and somehow, impossibly, everything was starting to work better than it was supposed to. You know what? Jake said, stepping back to admire their work. I think we're going to need a bigger shelter. The other species had established their survival perimeters and were beginning the careful process of long-term resource management. The humans were planning home improvements. What happened next would later be studied in xenobiology classes as either a masterpiece of adaptive engineering or evidence that humans were clinically insane. Possibly both. The humans had somehow decided that 3 separate survival pods weren't sufficient for their needs. Instead of using the equipment as designed, they began construction on what could only be described as a fortress. Not a shelter. Not a temporary habitat. A fortress. Jake had jury-rigged the power cores from all three pods into a single system that was producing roughly 4 times the energy output of the original design. This should have been impossible. The power cores were sealed units with built-in safety limiters. Jake had somehow bypassed the limiters, modified the output regulators, and created a feedback loop that turned the waste heat into additional power generation. The trick, he explained to no one in particular while elbowed deep in quantum circuitry, is realizing that safety limiters are just suggestions. The real question is, how much power do we actually need versus how much power can we get away with using? Tank had taken the 3 shelter pods and somehow welded them together into a single structure roughly the size of a small house. This wouldn't have been remarkable if he'd had welding equipment. Instead, he'd accomplished it using emergency heating units, metal scraps from the pod casings, and what appeared to be pure determination. "Sorry about the noise," he called out over the sound of improvised metalworking. "I know this probably wasn't what these things were designed for, but the structural integrity is actually way better when you combine them like this." Luna had established what she cheerfully called her defensive garden around the perimeter of their expanding complex, using seeds from their emergency rations, soil samples from the planet's surface, and her own improvised nutrient solutions. She was somehow growing plants that not only survived in Nightmare 7's toxic atmosphere but actively filtered it. "The beautiful thing about biochemistry," she said, carefully tending to what looked like a cross between a Venus flytrap and an air purification system, is that toxins are just chemicals waiting to be useful. These little guys are basically living atmospheric processors. The alien observers had given up trying to understand what they were seeing. The monitoring station was filled with increasingly frantic reports from field scientists who couldn't explain how any of this was working. "The human facility is now producing breathable atmosphere at a rate exceeding their metabolic requirements," one report stated. "Excess oxygen is being vented through what appears to be a recreational area, featuring some kind of water feature." "The water feature is a swimming pool," Zethara said weakly. "They're building a swimming pool on a death world." Another report came in. "The power output from the modified shelter is now equivalent to a small industrial facility. We're detecting what appears to be manufacturing equipment." Tank had indeed built manufacturing equipment. Using components from their emergency repair kits, medical supplies, and what looked like rocks he'd found lying around, he'd constructed something that was producing building materials from raw planetary resources. "The thing is," Tank explained while operating machinery that technically shouldn't exist, "once you have enough power and the right kind of chemical processors, you can make pretty much anything. Sorry if this seems like overkill, but if we're going to be here for a while, we might as well be comfortable." The other species were beginning to take notice. The Vortak team had established efficient but modest survival camps. The Mundari Collective had created a harmonious network of interconnected shelters. The Zephyrians had achieved perfect environmental adaptation within their designated areas. The humans had built what appeared to be a small city. "Status report on the human facility?" Zethara requested, no longer sure he wanted to know the answer. "Sir, they appear to have established defensive systems using modified emergency flares. They've created a hydroponic facility that's producing food surplus. Their atmospheric processing capacity could support a population roughly 10 times their current size. And what? They've started construction on what appears to be an entertainment complex." Jake had indeed moved beyond basic survival into what could only be described as aggressive territorial development. The modified emergency flares had been turned into a perimeter defense system that could probably stop a small invasion. The atmospheric processors were running so efficiently they were actually improving the local air quality. And yes, they were building recreational facilities. "Look," Jake said, reviewing the blueprints he'd sketched on the back of an emergency ration package, "survival is great and all. But you know what's better than surviving? Thriving. And you know what's better than thriving? Thriving with a really nice pool." The monitoring station received one final report that day. "The humans have established what appears to be a permanent settlement. They're requesting permission to extend their stay beyond the challenge duration to finish the upgrades." Zethara looked at the monitoring screens, showing the other species huddled in their survival shelters, while the humans relaxed in their fortress and realized he was watching the end of galactic civilization as they knew it. The humans had turned a survival test into a colonization project. And they weren't even finished yet. Nightmare 7 was called Nightmare 7 for a reason. The planet's designers, back when the Galactic Council was first establishing challenge worlds, had specifically engineered it to test the absolute limits of species survival. The weather patterns alone could shred most known materials. The wildlife considered everything else to be either food or competition. And the planet's geological instability meant that massive natural disasters were scheduled to occur at regular intervals. The disaster protocols were simple. When the planet's built-in catastrophes activated, contestants were expected to retreat to their survival shelters, deploy emergency shields, and wait for extraction if things got too bad. It was a test of preparation, resource management, and knowing when to admit defeat. The humans looked at the incoming apocalypse and decided it was home improvement time. The first sign of trouble came when the atmospheric monitoring systems started screaming warnings about an incoming solar storm. Nightmare 7's position in its system meant that solar radiation would hit the planet with enough force to sterilize most organic compounds. The Vortac immediately sealed their shelters and activated maximum shielding. The Mindori Collective coordinated their defensive procedures with flawless telepathic precision. The Zephyrians adapted their physiology to better handle radiation exposure. The humans went outside to get a better look. "Oh wow," Luna said, watching the sky turn colors that didn't have names in most languages. "This is actually beautiful. And look at these readings. The radiation is going to interact with my atmospheric processors in really interesting ways." Jake was examining their fortress's external systems with obvious interest. "You know what? I bet we could harness some of this energy. Solar storms are basically just really intense power sources if you know how to channel them." Hank was already modifying their defensive systems. "Sorry about this," he said to their perimeter installations while rewiring them, "but I think we can make you work better." The monitoring station watched in horrified fascination as the humans began treating the solar storm like a free energy delivery service. Instead of taking shelter, they were installing improvised collection arrays on their fortress's roof. "Are they trying to harvest the solar storm?" Zathara asked, no longer surprised by anything the humans did. "Sir, it appears they've modified their emergency flares into some kind of energy collection grid. They're actually channeling the solar radiation into their power systems." The storm hit. Across Nightmare 7's surface, the other species huddled in their shelters while instruments registered radiation levels that should have been immediately fatal. The Vortex shields held but showed dangerous stress readings. The Mindari Collective's coordinated defenses were barely containing the assault. The Zephyrians had adapted as much as their physiology allowed, but they were still being pushed to their limits. The humans' fortress not only weathered the storm, it got stronger. Jake's improvised collection system was feeding power into their already overcharged systems. Luna's atmospheric processors were somehow using the intense radiation to enhance their filtration efficiency. Tank's modifications had turned their defensive perimeter into a shield grid that was protecting not just their facility, but a significant portion of the surrounding landscape. "Power output from the human facility has increased by 600%, came the report. "They're now producing enough energy to run a small space station." Then came the meteor shower. Nightmare 7's orbital position meant it regularly passed through debris fields that would bombard the surface with high-velocity projectiles. Standard protocol was to seek underground shelter and wait for the bombardment to pass. The humans decided to redecorate. "Look at the size of those things," Jake said admiringly, watching meteors streak across the sky. "That's premium building material just falling out of the sky for free." Luna was examining the mineral composition readings from the incoming meteors. "Oh my God, these are perfect for expanding the atmospheric processing systems. The trace elements are exactly what my plants need." Tank was already preparing collection equipment. "Sorry about this," he said to the meteor shower, "but we're going to need you to land in more convenient locations." The other species watched from their underground shelters as the humans deployed what appeared to be a mining operation. Instead of hiding from the meteor shower, they were actively harvesting it. Tank's modified defensive systems were somehow redirecting smaller meteors to designated collection areas while their fortress's shields deflected the larger ones. "They're strip mining a natural disaster," Zethara said faintly. The final catastrophe was the emergence of Nightmare 7's indigenous life forms. The planet's ecosystem included several species of highly aggressive predators that normally remain dormant until triggered by the combination of solar radiation and seismic activity. These creatures were designed to test combat readiness and tactical thinking under extreme stress. The humans turned them into pets. "Oh, they're actually kind of cute," Luna said, watching what looked like a cross between a dragon and a wood chipper approach their perimeter. "Look at those biochemical adaptations. I bet they're just hungry." Jake was examining the creatures with professional interest. "You know what? I bet these things are perfect for perimeter security. They're already adapted to the local environment. They're clearly effective deterrents. And they seem pretty intelligent." Tank was already preparing what appeared to be food. "Sorry if this isn't what you usually eat," he said to the approaching predators. "But we made some modifications to the emergency rations that should work better with your digestive systems." The monitoring station fell silent as they watched the humans somehow domesticate creatures that were specifically designed to be undomesticatable. Within hours, the fortress was surrounded by what appeared to be a pack of extremely well-fed security guards who were now patrolling the perimeter in organized shifts. "Sir," came the final report of the day, "the humans have established what appears to be a functioning ecosystem. Their facility is completely self-sufficient. They're producing surplus resources, and they're now exporting improved atmospheric conditions to the surrounding area." Zethara looked at the monitoring screens showing the other species barely surviving in their shelters, while the humans were hosting what appeared to be a barbecue with their new pet monsters, and realized something terrifying. The humans weren't just surviving Nightmare 7. They were improving it. The Galactic Council emergency session was called at 0347 Galactic Standard Time, which was either very late or very early depending on your species' sleep cycle. Council observer Zethara stood before the assembled representatives of 17 different civilizations, trying to explain how a simple survival challenge had somehow turned into humanity's first interstellar real estate development project. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Councillor Vex Ayami, her crystalline voice ringing with barely controlled panic. "The humans have not only survived on Nightmare 7, they've established a permanent settlement?" "That's correct," Zethara replied, consulting his reports with the expression of someone who no longer trusted reality. "They're requesting an extension on their challenge duration to complete what they're calling Phase 2 of the resort development." Silence fell over the council chamber. In the background, the monitoring screens showed live feeds from Nightmare 7. The other species were being extracted according to standard procedures, not their survival pods loaded onto transport ships while they underwent medical evaluation for radiation exposure and psychological trauma. The humans were giving their new pet swimming lessons. "Resort development?" asked Councillor Thresh, his compound eyes focusing on the screens with obvious distress. "Yes, sir. They've submitted blueprints for what they're calling the Nightmare 7 Extreme Vacation Experience. The features include atmospheric adventure tours, solar storm viewing parties, and what they describe as authentic alien creature encounters with professional safety supervision." On the screens, Jake was installing what appeared to be a water slide while Luna guided one of the planet's apex predators through an obstacle course. Tank was constructing something that looked suspiciously like a gift shop. Councillor Brimoth leaned forward, her tentacles writhing with agitation. "What about the other contestants? Surely they demonstrated superior survival techniques." Zethara pulled up the comparative analysis reports. The Vortak team achieved textbook survival standards: minimal resource usage, efficient shelter deployment, successful completion of all basic survival protocols. The Mindari Collective maintained perfect coordination throughout the challenge. The Zephyrians demonstrated excellent adaptation strategies. And the humans? The humans appear to have accidentally conquered the planet. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several counselors' breathing apparatus working overtime. "Define conquered," Councillor Vex Ayami said carefully. "Well, make it." They've established territorial control over approximately 40 square kilometers of surface area. They've domesticated the indigenous wildlife. They've modified the local ecosystem to be more hospitable to off-world visitors. And they've set up what appears to be a manufacturing base capable of producing technology that exceeds Galactic Council specifications. On the screens, Tank was demonstrating a device that appeared to be generating matter from pure energy while apologizing to the laws of physics. Furthermore, Zithara continued, they've made contact with 3 other challenge worlds in the system and have begun what they're calling interplanetary consultation services. Apparently, other contestants have been requesting human assistance with their survival challenges. Counselor Threshake's voice rose to a pitch that suggested imminent panic. They're consulting on other challenges? How is that possible? They built a communications array using components from their emergency kits. It shouldn't work according to our understanding of subspace physics, but it's somehow capable of real-time communication across multiple star systems. The council chamber erupted in multilingual chaos. Representatives were shouting, humming, clicking, and in one case, changing colors rapidly in what appeared to be either distress or profanity. Council Supreme Leader Quarthex raised a appendage for silence. What do the humans want? Zethara checked his notes. They're requesting permission to establish permanent residence on Nightmare 7. They'd like to set up what they're calling a Galactic Adventure Tourism Company. They've also submitted a proposal for improving the Survival Challenge program, including upgrades to standard equipment and what they describe as more interesting catastrophes. More interesting catastrophes? Yes, sir. They feel that the current disaster protocols lack creativity. They've submitted designs for what they call advanced environmental challenges, including something they're calling a black hole proximity experience and controlled supernova viewing. On the monitoring screens, Luna was conducting what appeared to be a guided tour for a group of very confused-looking alien observers while Jake explained the modifications they'd made to local space-time. Supreme Leader Quarthex stared at the screens for a long moment. What's the status of our military technology development programs? Sir? Our weapons research, our defensive systems, our strategic military assets. How do they compare to what the humans built using emergency survival kits? Zethara consulted his classified files, then looked up with an expression of existential dread. Sir, based on preliminary analysis, the humans' improvised defensive systems could probably stop a medium-sized invasion fleet. Their manufacturing capabilities exceed most industrial worlds, and their energy output suggests they could power a small galaxy if they really put their minds to it. The council chamber fell silent except for the sound of several civilizations quietly reevaluating their place in the universe. Supreme Leader Quarthex made a decision that would later be known as the Nightmare 7 Accord. Send the humans a message. Tell them they win. Tell them they win everything. Tell them the entire challenge program is theirs if they want it. And whatever they do, do not give them access to military-grade equipment. What about their request to expand to other challenge worlds? Zethara asked. Approved. All of it. Give them whatever they want. And for the love of the great void, make sure they're happy. On the monitoring screens, the humans were now hosting what appeared to be an interdimensional barbecue, while several species of former apex predators served as waitstaff. Jake looked directly into the camera and waved. Hey, thanks for the great vacation spot. We're thinking of opening a chain. You guys want in? The Galactic Council realized they had created something far more terrifying than any weapon of mass destruction. They had given humans a hobby. The universe would never be the same.